District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program. Welcome to District of Conservation. I'm your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Listeners are in for a treat today. I am joined by CFACT colleagues, Craig Rucker, who is president and co-founder of the organization, and Marc Morano, publisher of Climate Depot, to give a debrief on COP29 and also what the future holds for climate policies, namely the climate alarmist movement, and what President Trump in a second term would likely do, or what he should do to ensure that sanity prevails over alarmism. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining and coming on the podcast finally.
Thank you, Gabby. Happy to be here.
Wonderful. So, whichever of you want to start first, talk about what COP29 or COP is, because you both have gone for many, many years. There was a lot of news coming from Baku, Azerbaijan, but it was also tied to a lot of the Trump cabinet announcements, obviously different Biden news. So what would you like listeners to take away from your experiences at the most recent COP? Is the conference still relevant? Is it going to fade into obsolescence in the future? What is your kind of initial preening into the affair?
Well, I think both of us have gone to a number of these COPs. They've been around since the 1990s. I guess I'll start with a little background. Mark, you can give your observations right after that. But there's been 29 of them dating back to right after the Convention on Climate Change was signed by George H. Bush back in the early 1990s. I think it was 1992 or 94, somewhere around there. There were like 4 treaties that came out of the Rio Earth Summit back then. This was one of them. Initially, it was a non-binding treaty, but as part of the arrangement, it was adopted by the U.S. Later became mandatory, like there was going to be anything decided at this convention or these meetings would become mandatory. That wasn't until like COP3 in Berlin. And they do this every year as part of the treaty negotiations to try to do different things. Initially back in 1997, it was to pass something called the Kyoto Protocol, which was the first attempt to have a binding international treaty to curb greenhouse gases. The U.S. did not ratify that. And in fact, it wasn't ratified under Clinton. It wasn't ratified under Bush. And Obama refused to put it before the Congress to get it ratified then as well. And that's because there was no support for it. In general, the objections to the Congress back then, there was something called the Byrd-Hagel resolution that went through in 1998 saying that if, in fact, developing countries are not going to curb their greenhouse gases, or it puts the U.S. at a competitive disadvantage economically because other parts of the world are not going to do the types of draconian things they want to do, then the U.S. isn't on board. And that was the case and why the Kyoto Protocol went kabish. Then there was an effort after that expired around 2012 to put in another treaty, and we eventually got the Paris Accord, which went in 2015. And that has initially been adopted by the Obama team, but never ratified. It was also then later rejected by Trump from basically 2016 to 2020. And then Biden got back into it. So what you're seeing right now and what this COP is trying to do is to implement the Paris Accords, which allow countries to have these various proposals they put in that are going to drastically reduce their greenhouse gases to the point where they can stop the world from gaining about 1.5 degrees Celsius by the end of 2100. And nations put in their different plans to do this as to what they're going to do to the agricultural sector, to their industrial sector, to their auto sector to try to reduce these emissions. Very few of them have really achieved anything along the lines of what they say they'll do, but they continue to have these meetings in exotic places to talk about how they're going to do them. And this year's was in Baku, Azerbaijan.
Yeah, and let me add some color commentary now to this COP29 in Baku. This is my 21st out of 23 in 2002, I think, or 2001, whenever, I guess it was 2002, of going to these UN summits. And I got to tell you, of all the summits, that I've ever been to out of these 21. This had the lowest energy. It was palpable. You could feel it. I would hold my hands up and just, sort of close my eyes. I mean, it was flat, nothing happening. There was no major world leaders who attended it other than the UK Prime Minister Starmer. The island nation, what was the island nation again? Was it Papua New Guinea that bailed out right
Papua
before?
New Guinea,
They said nothing happens at these summits. You had the French foreign minister refused to come over some perceived slight. So an entire delegation of French environmental activists didn't show up. Then you had Milei of Argentina have a conference call with Donald Trump, and the next day withdraws the 170-member delegation from Argentina. Then you have the opening day of the conference. You have the president of the COP from Azerbaijan, presiding over the UN Climate Summit, the host country, say oil is a gift from God, which sent everyone into a tizzy. So much so, they're now treating it like, what's it called, Blue Sky or Facebook or some other social media. They want to ban countries from participating unless they're completely on message with the UN agenda. And there's now calls for massive reforms. I think over 70 former UN officials, including the Secretary General and others, signed a letter calling for major reforms to this whole UN Climate Summit conference. Al Gore criticized it. It was just a bunch of backstabbing, fighting. Greta Thunberg decided not to go. She has not been at these in years. She called the whole UN process a greenwashing and a scam, which we can all, support Greta on this. Maybe she actually has grown up after all. Now, she's still a deep-seated climate activist, but at least she's honoring her principles. She knows that if you actually care about climate, if we did face a climate emergency, it's a scam, whatever the UN is attempting to do to control the climate. There was no Harrison Ford, no Leonardo DiCaprio. There was no billionaires like Soros, no billionaires like Bezos, no billionaires like Bill Gates, all who have been at previous UN climate summits. And so there was just a whole lot of not there. And as this continued, by the end of it, it just became acrimonious, bitter. All the environmental groups have now condemned it. This was supposed to be the COP finance. They had a $100 billion a year climate slush fund that the UN wanted to host. They wanted to turn it to 1 to 2 trillion, and they wanted to get all this corporate money into it. At the end, they ended up with a $300 billion pledge. And even that is laughable because the European countries who pledged to support it are all talking about competitive disadvantage if Donald Trump pulls us out. So it really was an orange pall, what's the right word? The PAL, that was a shadow over this conference, and it was in the form of Donald Trump. This, unlike 2016 when he first won, we were in Marrakesh, Morocco. Craig and I were forcibly ejected by armed UN climate cops when we had a cardboard cutout of Donald Trump and started shredding the UN Paris Agreement at the summit. And we were banned from the rest of attending that summit for doing that. But they just considered back then in 2016, Donald Trump was sort of a bad kidney stone that they had to pass through their system. But now there's serious realization, even among these hardcore activists from the UN who were in Baku, that times have changed. The EU suspended their Green Deal. They had the elections, which were majorly against the Greens. You had the farmers' revolt throughout Europe. You had the election in America, the election in Argentina, the fraud of solar wind being cheaper, taking over, all those promises. You have Canada spent $100 billion and their emissions are one of the worst performing. I think they are the worst performing of all the Western nations, according to a recent audit that just came out earlier this week, or maybe last week. So across the Western world in particular, people realize the fraud has been exposed. Donald Trump is back, and that is why the summit was a complete, utter disaster for the UN climate activists.
And I think a lot of people who may have initially bought into the jargon of the Paris Climate Accords, none of us fell for that, of course, but a lot of people I've seen on social media have started to question the aims of it, because even the most conservative estimates of the so-called pledges of the Paris Climate Accords, if you were able to factor in all the crazy demands, the green directives, at best, you would only reduce the global temperatures by 0.2 degrees Celsius. So it's a complete farce. You destroy the economy. You don't have any benefit to the environment. So I think more and more people are waking up to that realization. And you mentioned, of course, the backdrop of President Trump being reelected. What do you see both of you, him doing? I know the greater discussion among the free market environmental right is we're waiting to see what happens. We know what he's largely going to do. He's going to pull us out of the Paris Climate Accords. He's going to largely slash these net zero directives and hopefully codify a lot of these repealing of executive orders or encouraging Congress to get rid of the IRA or something of that sort. So what do you envision President Trump doing against the backdrop of this very interesting COP29 and also just his insistence to drill, baby, drill? And I think the initial reading is he's going to really shore up natural gas production too, and maybe even nuclear in addition to kind of the conventional energy sources. But what is your preening or look into a second Trump administration going off of COP29?
I think he's going to probably keep his word. I mean, he campaigned pretty aggressively against the Paris Accord. Of course, he got us out of it the first time. He put in a guy, a DOE, Chris Wright, who is known as somebody in a pro-energy drill baby drill guy who made a lot of money in fracking. So you see a really a total change in direction where Biden basically made climate not the number 2 or 3 most important issue in his administration. He claimed it was the most important issue in his administration. Trump, of course, has also spoken out against the EV mandates. He has been campaigning in places like New Jersey against the offshore wind, which is a 30,000 megawatts that Biden wanted to put in by 2030. And we'll see if, in fact, that he's able to do something about that, which we at CFACT, of course, have a vested interest in, as we're suing to try to stop that. So I think you're going to see a profound change and probably a cutback also in the funding. They wanted to get, well, first off, they've had this global green climate fund for $100 billion in place since 2009 during the Copenhagen conference. Since that time, and that's supposed to be $100 billion per year. Basically, if you looked at the balance sheet, even as of right now, it's been more like 13.5 billion they got. And a lot of that comes from countries just reassigning their current foreign aid to come in. So they're not even getting 100 billion. So it's kind of laughable that they moved that up to 300 billion and even talked about 1.2 trillion, as Mark said. And in addition to this was a COP finance conference at Baku. They also started something called a loss and damage fund. This is to help developing nations be able to cope with typhoons and hurricanes and tornadoes, things that they've always experienced, but now they credit them to man's activities, people driving their SUVs and the like. That's another 20 billion in addition to that countries are supposed to dole out each year. The pledges that were made in Baku were fairly pathetic. I think the U.S. gave about 17.5 million or something like that, and a couple other countries were around that level. They basically have maybe 20-30 million dollars of the 20 billion that they're supposed to kick in. So this was a disaster when it came to, it was supposed to be a finance fund that got them. They made great pledges. They haven't even honored the lower levels. So there's no reason to expect that this will go anywhere. And as far as Trump's concerned, I think it even has less of a possibility since they rely on the U.S. to provide much of this. I don't see them getting it.
Yeah, exactly. The groups that we compiled a list for Trump's second term is Heartland, E&E Legal, CFACT, Truth in Energy and Climate, and the American Energy Institute. And here's I'll just go through them really quick, the 10 points. Paris Climate Treaty, the key, and we talked about this before the show, Gabby, is we got to have it so that Trump just can't go in and reverse executive orders and do new executive orders because they can just be reversed again in 4 years, much of like his first term agenda was done. So this time, and this is important, 1992, Craig mentioned it earlier, George H.W. Bush got us involved in the whole United Nations Framework Convention, which led to the UN Climate Treaty Summits. It was the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. And if Donald Trump treats the Paris Climate Treaty as instead of an executive agreement, if he treats it as a treaty and submits it to the Senate for ratification, it will be surely rejected in the Senate, which would then relieve the U.S. of any and all obligations from this treaty unless the Senate formally ratifies it at some point in the future. So that's what we're looking for. If he had done that last time, you couldn't have Joe Biden immediately put us back in because it's an executive agreement. So we want to get out of that process, make it as difficult as possible. We also need him to get rid of the EV mandates, all these incentives, all the fundings, get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act, which, by the way, I'm now convinced this is going to be perhaps, not, I don't want to say impossible, one of Donald Trump's most difficult tasks. And the reason for this is both from the automaker level, they're lobbying to keep it, obviously, they're getting billions and by hundreds of billions of dollars. From the small town governors, congressional districts who are going to be voting on the repeal of this Inflation Reduction Act, they are loading up money in these little towns that, a Chinese EV factory will come in, or there's some companies coming in, and they might make boom for 6 months to a year with a lot of federal money, and then it would go under. But it's what shocked me the most, and what's really, sort of got me shocked, is the farmers' lobby, who were always skeptical of climate change, are now coming out and basically saying, climate is a problem and we want this money for carbon capture. And we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars flowing to the farmers now, and farmers are now turning to be the biggest advocates. So I don't want to get too far into that, but I was just going to say the Inflation Reduction Act is no done deal that will be repealed. Many Republican congressmen are pushing back. It's, as Ronald Reagan said in 1964, that once a government program is instituted, it's the nearest thing to eternal life on earth. We still have Obamacare, by the way. And of course, that was from John McCain. But anyway, okay, oil and gas leasing on federal lands, appointing people, in which we've seen a lot of great appointments to all these key agencies from EPA, Interior, offshore wind. We have to literally start, treating it at least at the very level like a fossil fuel project, so they can't just keep popping it and bypassing and start looking at the impacts on species. Coal, we need a lot more. We need to resurrect coal to any extent that we can. And of course, a couple other ones: litigation, regulatory reform, regulatory burden. We have a whole list of 10 items for Trump to follow. And we expect him, all his appointees and everyone seems to be all on board with this.
I would love to link to the 10 priorities. And I think I saw that somewhere circulated in one of the news outlets, but I would be more than happy to include that. And it's interesting you mentioned coal, because earlier this year, like almost a decade after Obama put restrictions on federal coal leases, I think a federal judge actually said it was illegal for then President Obama to put those restrictions in place. So we will probably see a shoring up of coal, because coal is a big factor into electricity generation after natural gas. It's one of the top ones. Actually, no, it's nuclear after natural gas, and then also coal is about 16.2% of that. And because of regulation, of course, it's been less influential as well. And so we will be seeing, I think, the conventional energy sources go up. Trump has been pretty skeptical of nuclear, and I know nuclear, a lot of us want it, and I certainly want it to be catalyzed. I'm worried that the only way that it could be elevated is through continued IRA subsidies. We've seen some projects only get approval because they've been tied to government spending. I really want the private sector really unleash it, and there is an appetite in the private sector to do that. But I think Trump's biggest, I would say, hurdle or challenge with respect to these environment, energy, climate issues is he going to be able to successfully usher in the repeal of the IRA, even if some Republicans who didn't vote for it but love to kind of leech off of the so-called benefits, even though it's going to produce a lot of solyndras, from what we're looking into the situation, because he has to make the connection, and maybe you both, and I think you both agree with this, that that law, coupled with the American Rescue Plan, the bipartisan infrastructure plan, all the spending which had climate provisions, contributed to this energy inflation that we see, the higher gas prices, the higher fuel costs, all these ridiculous energy efficiency standards. And so I would hope that with the mandate he has, he really does accomplish something like that within the first 2 years, because if he doesn't repeal it, then what was he elected for? That's kind of my reading into it.
I couldn't agree with you more, Gabby. I said that we used to say, and I was in the military a long time, an army travels on its belly, which means as long as it's being fed, it can continue to push on. And that is the case with the IRA money. They are feeding, and that was clever on the part of Biden to put all that money in toward these things, because they, as Mark said, closest thing to eternal life is a government program. As long as it's being funded, it will continue to exist. And that needs to be probably just about the top priority. I think that, and overturning the endangerment finding would be another big one. That's one we're going to be trying to target at CFACT. This whole idea that the EPA has to regulate CO2. They really never relied on sound science to make that policy. The court in gave them permission to regulate it, but they didn't say they had to regulate it. But there's been so much science that's come out since that time, since around 2008-9, when that decision was made to call CO2 a pollutant, that I think it can be challenged successfully. And it has such a disrupting impact on the economy that I think it's high time it be revisited, so that, the EPA should not be allowed to call something a pollutant like that's natural, basically, a CO2. It's something that's common. When it disrupts the economy to the extent it does, to the point that they're going to change our vehicles, tell us we have to eat bugs, cows can't fart or burp. They got all these different things. This type of regulation should have to be approved by Congress because of its disruption to the U.S. economy. That wasn't done. We'd like to see something done about the endangerment finding as well. And obviously choking off the IRA. I don't think there's a higher priority just about than those two items, because so long as there's money, they'll continue to push these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially the death of 1,000 cuts. They're plundering our energy and our electrical grid in the U.S. with everything from Craig mentioned, the cows, the agricultural, the EV. Every little thing is raising costs and rationing energy, freedom of movement, food. It's an amazing thing. And by the way, breaking news right before we went on the air with this podcast, Reuters News just released Biden pushes out, this is new, over $100 billion more in clean energy grants as his term winds down. According to Reuters, his administration has awarded $100 billion under the Inflation Reduction Act, and they hope the spending milestone will continue the deployment. So what they're doing is this is how they're buying votes. And I wouldn't be surprised if we did an analysis of this new $100 billion that they're pumping out at the end, that it's going into a lot of key Republican districts that are going to be on the fence voting for the repeal of this because they don't want this to go away. This is one of the greatest wealth transfers, scam investments we ever had. It was only authorized by Congress for, I think, $270 billion. And now the latest estimates are it's approaching $2 trillion in spending. Mm-hmm. I don't even know how this is possible. Congress votes on one. It's because of the way, I guess, the wording of the bill. They put it in a sort of perpetuity into the future. And they can just keep spending and spending and spending and spending. And there's no end to this. And of course, you can create the illusion of solar and wind jobs and, oh, look at the green energy's growing. Look at all these factories and EV plants. It's all nonsense. It's all government make work.
It's true. And yeah, the fact that Republicans, they can't say that we're fighting against energy inflation, then simultaneously say we want to protect these certain projects we didn't vote on because it's a boon to our districts. But as we've seen with Solyndra and all these other projects, and I think another example, in addition to this other $100 billion, I think the IRA, if made permanent, would be, you're right, close to $2 trillion, well above the projected $370 billion. I think that they were saying it was still bad at that price tag. It's going to be worse if made permanent. But it just seems like people did not learn the lesson of Solyndra, and Republicans have equally bought into this, like Democrats, because of this allure. And sadly, something, enabled by this all of the above rhetoric versus reliable energy phrasing. And all of the above, I think a conversation we're going to have is maybe going to be challenged a bit more to say that we don't want to have intermittents, which have to be subsidized and that don't work, not even 40% of the year. We shouldn't be putting this into the grid. We shouldn't be shoring up projects artificially and creating this artificial demand and limited energy supply and amount from these really lackluster sources. And you start to see, especially with the conversation of nuclear, all these people who were net zero proponents saying we have to decarbonize our grid. Now, all of a sudden, they've kind of changed their tune temporarily when it comes to nuclear to power their AI data centers. Now they've said we want natural gas and nuclear because solar and wind are not reliable, but they still haven't fully abandoned their decarbonization pledges. So do you think maybe slowly but surely, because of Trump's win and maybe the wind's changing with respect to this climate movement, that people are waking up and realizing we can't really believe in this folly anymore? We have to support reliable energy that produces this great quality of life that we have.
The answer to that could be seen in Europe. I think Mark alluded to this earlier, but we know where the path leads if we choose to go net zero and rely more and more on renewables. There's countries that have already done this and gone much further than we have. Germany launched in the early 2000s an energy agenda, and under Merkel, and it was a disaster. They're paying right now over 40 cents a kilowatt hour. Average Americans are somewhere between 10 and 12 cents a kilowatt hour. They're paying, 3, 4 times what we do in electricity. And the same with Denmark, the same with England. We see in California. They used to be a net energy exporter. Now they're an importer of energy. Australia, brownouts, blackouts. These have not been good for the economy, and the people have rebelled. We've seen the farmers protest over the fertilizer mandates where they're trying to cut back on their agricultural produce and stuff. We've seen the Greens take a bath in the elections last, so the ramifications of going that route are already manifest for us, just looking overseas and looking to even the states in the United States where they try to implement these. So it's not a good scene. It's also bad for the environment. We have seen a precipitous rise in whale beachings off our coast. We've seen eagles slaughtered in places like Wyoming and Montana from these things. They've even had to give themselves an exemption for wind power to allow them to kill a certain amount of eagles, or the thing would be run out of business. This is exemptions they would never grant the fossil fuel industry. And they rely on rare earth minerals, as has often been said, taken from the most egregious places of human rights on the earth, places like the Congo, and where they get the cobalt, and also using Uyghur slave labor in China. There's nothing environmentally good about this. It's not good for consumers as it jacks up, or businesses, jacks up energy costs. And, it's just a disaster in the making.
And I think I don't know if Bill Maher interviewed Jane Fonda over the weekend. A new interview, and they were talking about why Kamala Harris lost. And he was talking about the crazy left, and he was using transgender. And Jane Fonda had claimed she never even heard that a man could get pregnant. She's like, no one says that. What are you talking about? She said, none of the news sources I read. And I think the realization is going to hit them, the climate community, that the similar type thing is happening, where they literally have gone so over the top that they become a laughingstock and no one takes them seriously. Just some of the examples. Climate change causes post-traumatic stress disorder. Spain just introduced paid climate leave so workers can avoid traveling during weather emergencies. Very similar to a climate lockdown, sort of a stay-at-home order. UN Secretary General at COP29 said the fate of humanity is at stake at that summit. I mean, again, it's just people just dismiss it. A peer-reviewed study came out a couple weeks ago. Climate change makes toilets more likely to break, which leaves people more likely to go outside. Therefore, climate change is encouraging unsanitary toilet practices. I mean, this is the kind of stuff showing up in mainstream scientific journals, and this is the stuff that kills a movement. It just they've jumped the shark, whatever phrase you want to need there. The other thing, which I didn't get to mention, is the Taliban, for the first time, showed up at COP29, and they were actually representing the Afghan government. Now, keep in mind, the Taliban for years is being slowly rehabilitated from the international pariah by who? Our mainstream media. Newsweek, CBS, Washington Post have all done things like the Taliban, is basically better than Donald Trump because they care about climate change. They're tackling the climate crisis head on. And now for the UN to welcome them at COP29, that was a whole new thing. And I was joking that a serial killer on death row, if they want to increase their chance of possibly avoiding the death penalty, or any convict, all they got to do is start embracing climate alarmism, and they'll get positive media reports. Who knows? It could influence them. And yet, Grist magazine say things like Trump wins, the planet loses. They've reduced themselves, and I'm talking about the mainstream climate left, if you will, to just punchlines. The stuff they claim and talk about is hilarious. The UK Guardian was one of my favorites. Trump's win sets back global climate action and poses major threat to the planet. And this is what they're dealing with, and this is why no one takes them serious. And it's one thing to subsidize like the IRA, but it's another to get anyone actually concerned. I think the idea that people are concerned about man-made climate change, that's got to be dead for 5 to 10 years. I just don't even think young people, and the polling even showed young people have this fatigue. They split about evenly. The climate youth that was supposed to go overwhelmingly for Kamala ended up splitting and voting with Donald Trump about half, 50-50, according to the exit polls.
By the way, Gabby, I just wanted to add this too, speaking along this lines, on an encouraging note. The average developing world representative at COP29 loves Trump. We've talked to people. I had a chance one-on-one with delegates from Sierra Leone and Togo and other places. We actually, when we entered into the conference, one of our associates, Peter Murphy, was bringing our MAGA hats in, and we did kind of a film thing in there, as we like to do, provoke things. And it turned out that all the people who were doing the metal detectors at the operation wanted to wear our hats. It was warmly received. Mark and I noticed anecdotally, because we flew through Istanbul on our way there, that the taxi drivers, hotel clerks, everybody, when they saw a MAGA hat or they heard about Donald Trump, thumbs up. So, this whole idea that he's a fiend of the earth, people aren't going to embrace him. He is, he's a rock star. Even at the COP climate conference, not among Canada, not among France or Germany or some of the developed countries, which of course abhor him, but among the developing countries, they love him.
That is true. And I think a lot of our allies are warmly receiving to him again. You both know that I just had interviewed one of the vice ministers from Lithuania. Lithuania is not a freeloader country, and they are wanting to work with us on nuclear and natural gas. And so the smart European countries and perceived allies are wanting to be cooperative with Trump. But that's very fascinating. I saw the pictures in our group chat. You guys were talking about that. That was very interesting to see that happen and transpire at COP29. It's also Giving Tuesday. I would love you both to make a pitch for why people should support the contributions of CFACT. I've loved working with you guys for the better part of 6-7 years. We have a lot of fun. You guys sponsor the podcast. I also host the Conservation Nation series. As we round out the conversation, make the pitch for Giving Tuesday if you can.
Well, we do a lot of work, and you can check us out at cfact.org. That's cfact.org. And Mark, of course, is also part of ours, one-stop shop on all things climate change. For us to carry on our important work to educate the public about why the Greens are too extreme, about what are positive solutions, to how we can tackle conservation issues. And if you like programs like this one, we need your help. So visit us at cfact.org. That's cfact.org. And we'd appreciate anything you can offer us today in terms of support.
Yeah, and again, the support we need to go to these conferences, expose what's happening on them. We have a whole collegiate network with speakers and recruiting student activists, and we fight the battle of climate, energy, environment. We're at the forefront, and we're going to hopefully be guiding the Trump administration in the years ahead here.
Thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate the update. We'll have to do this more frequently and not wait many years to bring you both on the podcast. We last had Adam, God rest his soul, on the podcast when I first started working with you guys. So we should do periodic updates, maybe every 6 months or something, to give everyone an insight into what is happening. So appreciate you both coming on the show, talking about COP, climate, and maybe it being kept at bay with a second Trump administration. So thank you both. Really appreciate it and the update.
Thank you, Gabby. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Gabby.
If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played, and also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day, and please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.